Welcome back, everyone, from your break. As you can see, Isabel and I have moved into another corner of the studio where it's a bit more relaxed and we can sit down in the chair at the end of the afternoon, of a busy afternoon. I hope you had a break as well and that you enjoyed it, and also the breakout sessions. We are now here for the final part of today, which is a panel discussion where we have 4 eminent guests joining us via Zoom. And the theme of the panel is opportunities and limitations of carbon budgets and science-based approaches to societal transitions. And I mentioned briefly in the beginning of the program today that I'm a PhD student, but I thought I would add that I'm a PhD student within the research program for natural resources and sustainable development at the Department of Earth Sciences. And part of my research is funded by the Swedish Energy Agency, where we actually are looking at how regional carbon budgets are being employed as a tool for rapid mitigation and aligning regional, local, and national climate policies with the commitments as enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And I will be moderating this this virtual panel, and I guess in some sense it's really a part of my research. So I'm going to be asking questions that I'm really curious about, and I hope that you're curious about as well, building on some of the questions and contributions that we've had throughout the day. But now having three new people join us in addition to Kevin. And I will introduce each speaker as I also ask them a question. So I will start with one question of each panelist and also introduce them at the same time. And with us from Manchester in the UK is Carly McLachlan. And she is Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre and Professor of Climate and Energy Policy at the University of Manchester. And one thing that I've come to think about a lot is, of course, this is a global issue that we have, climate change, but it's quite important to remember to concretize and contextualize these issues. And one way of doing that is, of course, of looking into particular places and regions. And I know, Carly, that in your work, you have been working quite closely with your particular region as well, with the Manchester City Council, and also developing the carbon budget framework, basically, for them as well. So I'd like to first ask you, just tell us briefly about how this has evolved, and also, have you seen any particular policies or changes in governance over the past few years since this carbon budget was introduced?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I mean, the work with Manchester, we already had a close relationship with our local combined authority and our city council. And so we've been doing things with them around their climate strategy and their climate policy for many years. But they really came to us to say that they wanted to set a new target. And there's a kind of interesting reason for that, which is to do with the work that people like Kevin Anderson and Alice Larkin have been doing for many years from our team, that actually local activists were saying to local politicians, we need to do more. Look, this work in your own city is saying that actually the sort of global effort on climate change isn't urgent or rapid enough. And so as a city, we should commit to that. So they came to us to say that they wanted to set a carbon budget for the city, and actually we bid for money to central government in the UK to pay for a project called Scatter, where we set up a tool to set local carbon budgets in the UK. And I think it's been successful because they were a very engaged client, if you like. They really understood what they were getting into. They wanted to know the complications and the difficulties. And in a kind of different way to how many local authorities have set a climate emergency target, where they've declared a climate emergency, they've set a target like net zero by 2030. Manchester kind of did it the other way around. They understood that it was very difficult to do, that they actually didn't have a pathway to the target that they were declaring, but they declared it anyway. But they did that pre-work around understanding that first. And I'm not saying which one's right or wrong, but it's just different to how many other places have done it. So what have we seen since then? Well, we've seen a kind of a change in the way that they do decisions locally, that every decision going up to the combined authority has to have a statement about its contribution to the 2038 target. And actually the next phase of work we've done as a team is to work with them to co-produce a co-benefits decision support tool. Not that snappy a name, but basically what it means is that for every decision going through the combined authority, they take a much broader perspective and build in carbon assessment as well as other elements. And I think for me, you know, looking at the questions that you're thinking about across the conference, it's really important that we kind of stick around and continue to help with that delivery part, with empathy for the other goals that combined authorities, local authorities have, to try and help them deliver, because the target alone does very little. It's the delivery part after that. So it's been hugely important. It's really helped people understand the concept of a budget and using it up too quickly. It's allowed other actors in the city to also make targets on that basis. So like our district network operator for the electricity system has also adopted a target based on our work. So has like Manchester City Football Club, you know, like they're big players that have done it. So it's been really important. But, you know, if we thought it was difficult to get agreement to that, the next bit, the actually delivering that kind of level of change is really dwarfing the amount of effort it required to get the target through in the first place.
Thank you, Carly. I think we'll get back to some of these questions after we've introduced all the speakers as well, but thank you for those initial reflections. We also have with us Martin Wetterstedt, who is a researcher and practitioner employed at Uppsala University and the Mälardalen Energy Agency. And he works at the interface between the research and practice of energy transitions and climate mitigation. And we've worked quite a bit together actually over the past few years when it comes to developing the carbon budget at the local and regional level in Sweden. But now, Martin, I know that you're also involved with some projects that look at this more internationally as well. And I guess my question to you, Martin, would be in your dual role as researcher and practitioner, I guess this has enabled you to look at issues from different perspectives. And I know that you've been working on climate change for a long time as well. So for you, what is the unique difference that sort of a carbon budget framing brings to the picture in comparison to other attempts throughout the last decades when we've had, you know, a focus on PPMs or whatever would have it be? What is sort of unique about the carbon budget framing that you've seen and how this plays out, particularly maybe in your role as practitioner?
Thank you, Isak, and others for inviting me. Well, I have been working outside academia from between 2010 and 2017, I think, at the municipal level. And I mean, in the role of an energy strategist and working with climate issues as well. And starting in 2010, I think I was talking to a lot of people working in the same position, and we were lacking goals at the local level for climate emission decreases of greenhouse gases and such. There has been programs all along from the Energy Agency or the Swedish EPA, for example, to stimulate mitigation at the local level, but there has been no real sort of support in setting targets at the local level. And also, I mean, previous goals from the IPCC and such, talking about PPMs at the global level, it has been very difficult to sort of break down to the local level. So I think what I experienced with the carbon budgets is that it's something that you can make that can become quite tangible at the local level and sort of broken down to that level. And it also sort of moves, I think, the debate from maybe before it was a lot about forecasting. You looked at sort of what was possible or what you thought were possible at the local level and sort of set targets in line with that, that you knew really that you wouldn't fail in delivering. But now, when we're looking at the budgets, it's more about backcasting, and also it sort of highlights that every year counts. So that even a 2030 year target, I think it's quite far into the future for a lot of us. So I think breaking that down to actually saying that, well, 2021 or 2022 is really important for the situation in 2030. That makes a big difference for many for sort of making it more concrete.
Thanks, Martin. I might get back to you later on a question about the challenges of translating, the science of carbon budgets into policy as well. But we'll move on now to our third panelist, eminent panelist, which is Stefania Barca, who's the current Zenström Professor in Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University. And she's also a scholar in the environmental humanities with a strong commitment to questions of justice. And Stefania, as we were speaking before this event and your contribution to this, you made it clear to me that you were no expert on carbon budgets, but that you were here to listen and learn, and also to think about how the issue of carbon budgets relates to the broader sort of climate change situation that we're in, and also the broader ecological crisis and questions of social injustice and so forth. And I know that you've studied, your background is in economic history and labor movements and so forth as well. And one of the things you said is that I'll probably be asking more questions than providing answers. And I think in some sense, I think this is such an important insight in some sense, because I think we only get the answers that we ask questions about in some ways. So I would be very curious to hear now from you if you have any questions so far, about 2.5 hours into our first day of this conference. What's been on your mind? What are the sort of questions that have come up for you that perhaps we can also discuss in the panel?
Absolutely. Thanks, Isak, and thanks for the invitation. I've been really learning a lot. I can mention a few questions that came up while Kevin was speaking, and particularly, I was really struck by the way he presented the carbon budget idea as a really effective way of dealing with what we need to do, right? But the question that came to mind was, first of all, provided that countries would adopt this, national governments would adopt this approach, then shouldn't we need some supranational governance kind of level that grants that this approach then is implemented? Because of course between the good intentions, we have also learned about that, between declarations, right, and then the actual implementation of these programs, in between there will be politics, right? There will be conflicting interests and oppositions on the part of different social sectors and lobbying, etc., etc. So governments might find themselves paralyzed or not actually capable of implementing their own ideas about carbon budgets, provided that they might want to do it. And the other question was also coming out of by listening to Kevin's speech, was how would carbon budgets relate to carbon trading, in the sense that when he said each country should find its own ways of implementing its carbon budget, I thought maybe among these ways of implementing carbon budget, certain countries which have the economic power will consider carbon trading. So trading their quotas with other world areas, other countries, as it is already largely happening, and not with good results, neither in terms of carbon reduction, carbon emission reductions, nor of course in terms of global justice. So I would stop here for the moment, but I can raise more issues maybe further on in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Stefania. And before I ask Kevin a question, I just like to remind, I've seen quite a few of you have started writing questions in the chat as well. And please keep doing that. And Isabel here sitting next to me is kind of following that, and we'll be bringing in your questions also into the conversation in a little while. But yes, Kevin, we've already heard you speak today, and you've already been properly introduced, and you've introduced yourself, so I won't do that. But I would be quite curious to hear your thoughts on Stefania's questions, and also anything else that's come up since the talk that you gave in the beginning here. So I'll leave it quite open to you to just reflect very briefly on the questions that just Stefania brought up, and if there's anything else you'd like to bring to the fore here for us to discuss.
Yeah, well, I'll respond directly to the carbon trading one. I'm less concerned about that if we're serious about climate change, and that's simply because there's going to be no spare capacity for anyone to be trading. Now, if we want to carry on with the sort of light touch climate change that we have today, trading's fine. Well, it's not fine, but it's all part of the process of failure. But if you're serious about delivering the rapid shifts that are necessary, no country, no sector, almost no individual is going to have any surplus capacity to take on board other people's requirements. Everyone is going to be working at their absolute capacity to deliver the rates of change that are necessary. And that's because we haven't done anything for 30 years. So there won't be capacity in Ghana or Nigeria or Kenya for the US or the EU or the UK to pass on their burden. So carbon trading is only there because we have an incredibly weak framework for climate change. There'll be no trading between sectors because the car sector is going to really struggle. So it can't take on emissions burdens from the aviation sector. The aviation sector can't pass it to the hospital sector because the hospitals are really struggling. And so I think we have to remind ourselves that we're serious about 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. Everyone is working, flat out. That is our new, if you like, new mission of society, is to deliver those sorts of rates of change. And I think we still see climate change as a bolt-on to business as usual, which allows trading to work. So we're serious, and I'm not concerned about it. But on an overall reflection, I just come back on, this will maybe sound a little strange, this. I think we mustn't overplay what science can tell us. Science only informs the debate. Science tells us, science can't tell us what's dangerous. Scientists might have a view as citizens as to what's dangerous. Science can't tell us that. And we have to remind ourselves what the carbon budget's about, what the temperatures are about. What we're talking about in climate change is trying to avoid what was called back in 1992 dangerous climate change. But what the hell is that? What's dangerous is a decision that's made, or judgment that's made, in a messy, uneven, unfair process of groups coming together in various ways and discussing things. And that eventually gets played out in the big political process with lots of, particularly usually, poorer people marginalized. But that process has come in the end to say, well, what are the impacts that we can deal with? And it's not the impacts from it, it's the rate of change of impacts. If impacts occur over 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, who really worries about that? The point is we're looking at impacts that are occurring over times where systems, human systems and ecological systems can't respond. And the proxy we've used for rate of change of impacts is temperature. It's not a great proxy, but it's probably one of the best that's out there. And so therefore, the processes of publics coming together, that messy, very messy process that meets in the COPs and all those other things around that, has deemed that 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade is probably the least unacceptable threshold of impacts that we can deal with over the shortest time frame. But remember, those temperatures are over short time frames, over 50 or 100 years. And so we have to remind ourselves that all this is about values and about humans coming together to decide what is and is not appropriate. Science does nothing more than inform that debate. And we mustn't overplay this language of, I like the language of listen to the science, but don't listen necessarily to the scientists. The scientists know no more about what we should do about this challenge, or what is or is not dangerous, what is the right or wrong value judgment, than anyone else in society. But be informed by the science, but don't use that as an excuse for the rest of us not to engage more fruitfully and more difficultly in terms of, we've got to think about it ourselves into the judgment of values. I think science is partly being misused here, not necessarily in this event, but overall is misused as if it tells us what to do, and it doesn't.
Thank you, Kevin. And actually, that was going to be my next question to the panel. What is the role in science in all this? So you already sort of presented the background to my question. So I think I'll just jump directly to the question I had. And this question is actually informed, you know, with discussions and debates that you and I have had, Kevin, but also with other colleagues in the UK, Andy Sterling and others. You know, the question of, I mean, a lot of sort of environmental movements in the past and a lot of social change as well in the past have been built on people's experiences of injustices or of problems at the local level, et cetera, or of environmental degradation. But they've also often been built on values and sort of visions for a better world as well. And I think there is a risk, and I sort of see this also playing out with the current situation with the pandemic also, that there's a lot of faith put in a particular set of scientific domains and particular scientists as well, perhaps looking at this. And this goes for all these sort of issues that we think about when it comes to crisis situations. So I guess my question to the other panelists now, because Kevin has already asked or responded to my question, is what are the risks and problems, if you see any, from your various vantage points with the narrative of science-based approaches as a main driver of societal transitions? And then, of course, carbon budgets being one example here in this conference that we're very interested in. So I will perhaps maybe start with Carly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd made some notes before we spoke, and unusually for Kevin and I, we agree to some degree on this, because the point I was going to make is about that translation through values into what's important. So thinking of my context locally, you know, we can say, listen to the science. We can say this is the level of reduction that, given that you've said you want to make an equitable contribution to the Paris commitment, this is the level you should be reducing at. But there are many other things going on for the local decision makers and the local communities of Manchester that have to be navigated alongside that. So equally, we could be having this whole conference on a completely different topic, like child poverty in Manchester. And we could say, listen to the science on child poverty about what we should do about that. And actually, you have the skill in it all is having to mix those together. And I think the visioning part is so important, because we shouldn't delude ourselves. You know, it's not that we can just paint the most rosiest of, you know, easy glide paths to a low carbon future. But if there isn't something that we can paint that is a positive, prosperous picture of Manchester in my context, I think it's very difficult to imagine how you get local politicians and local people to be part of that. They need to be able to see how they can lead a prosperous life, an enjoyable, joyful life within this context, that tackles the other things that they think are important locally. So we should, of course, be informed by it. I think an area where I would slightly disagree with Kevin is that actually scientists or experts are important in this, because they can apply a judgment to the science that they see, and they can help policymakers understand the important elements of this, or the sort of pitfalls that they could get into. But I think it's really important that if we're ever in those roles, we're very conscious of what the boundaries of our expertise are. And that we're not bringing our values as broader citizens in without making that clear. So I think it's helping policymakers understand where there's value judgments to be made. And there actually isn't just an answer from the science, but a range of options and what the implications of choosing different things is.
And maybe we can move on to, would you like to reflect a bit on this, Martin?
I can give it a shot. I might go at it from a different angle, maybe. I mean, we have also almost touched upon the difference between sort of the is-ought problem is a philosophical problem, or the fact-value distinction, which I think, I mean, Kevin talked about without those words. But even if we sort of talk about the science as such, science is a very complex thing. We're talking about very complex models and understanding of the Earth system and feedbacks and things, and that's when that sort of needs to be communicated and sort of brought into practice, that a lot of sort of filtering and translation is going on. So I think that a lot of people might think that sort of net zero, if I sort of align with Kevin's view on net zero, but a lot of people might think that this is the science that's being communicated to us. So it's the science can have different phases, I guess, or even even though the world is as it is, but we're making models and mental models of it, and sort of things get disturbed along the way. Yeah.
How about you, Stefania? What are your thoughts after listening to these other eminent panelists?
Yeah, no, thanks. This is a really interesting conversation. I was thinking that, I agree that with Martin, there are different kinds of science. And so we shouldn't assume a certain specific science, idea of the scientist. There are the social scientists, for example, and Carly made an example about that. And even if I'm not a positivist, I do think that social studies do offer data to and analysis on social processes that are also relevant, and also on political decision-making processes, on how democracy works, and that is also relevant to the business, let's say, of system change, right? So these are also forms of science that are to be brought into the conversation when we talk about science-based approaches. But something also I wanted to say is about from the point of view of the discussion we were having in the breakout room before about just transition, from the point of view of the just transition, what science is telling us is that from the point of view of the trade unions who have put forward this just transition framework, science is telling us that the post-carbon transition must happen, and it's going to happen regardless of what workers in certain sectors will think, because it's necessary. This is what science, so science is coming to the labor subject as as somebody who is saying, look, you will have to make sacrifice, because you will have to be sacrificed yourself to certain categories of workers because of the greater common good, and science is telling them this is going to happen. So the just transition is a strategy. It was born as a strategy from the unions to say, okay, let's if this is going to happen, let's make our voice heard, and let's be at the table, as Sharon Barrow says. She's the Secretary General of International Trade Unions Confederation, and she says, if you're not at the table of the negotiations, it means you're on the menu. So that's how the labor movements is perceiving this, science discourse. They're seeing it as somebody that is coming to eat them, and they will have to somehow defend themselves. So it's a defensive strategy. But what if, as Carly was mentioning before, what if there are other different ideas of just transition that come from the environmental justice, climate justice movements, frontline communities, Black people who have been heavily impacted by this particular industrial model of industrial development that we have. So these people they see the just transition as great opportunity to change the world and to make a better world for themselves, a world in which, a less unjust world. So, what science tells you and what is your response, it very much depends on who you are and where are you located and positioned in society and in power relations.
Thank you, Stefania, for these really important reflections and contribution. Thank you, all of you, for answering my question that I was curious about, including Kevin, who introduced it. I'm now quite curious, actually, to hear if we have any questions from the participants as well. Isabel.
Yes, we have some questions, and feel free to keep them coming. If you have a question that's general, that's fine. If you have a question for a particular panelist, feel free to indicate that in your question. But how we'll do this, I'll pose a few of the questions that we have so far to all of you wonderful panelists, Isak too, if you feel like jumping in. And after giving you some of the questions, feel free to jump in on a question you feel like you would like to respond to. So there's one or two points in here about what it means to have rapid action now. What are the first steps? We also have a question on the insight that psychology can bring us for these different processes and how they can help us with communication and participation, particularly where we're having these difficulties in finding convergence and agreement. We have a reflection on how we can conceptualize rapid transitions, for example, that temperature might be a more tangible way of presenting climate related action than parts per million. Does anyone feel like jumping in on any of those points?
Well, if no one's saying anything, these pauses that often happen in Sweden that never happen in the UK because everyone's always desperate to get in. It's a sort of cultural difference between the two. Just on the rapid side of it, and actually this partly goes back to responding to Carly, I think. So we can actually get some disagreement with Carly and I, which there normally is a little bit. The technology, and that also actually plays on some of the discussion. We keep talking about science, and actually there's a difference between science and technology, and I think we're muddling those two up in a really dangerous way. Science, I won't go into this now, but I think science is the nearest thing that we have even if the constructivist head on, the nearest thing we have to being apolitical, but technology is innately and rightly political. And I think we have to differentiate between those two. And I think we're muddling the two up here in a potentially quite dangerous way. But in terms of rapid change, if we are serious about our commitments, our Paris commitments, then what we know is that we cannot deliver a structural technical change in our infrastructure, physical change, in a time frame that's going to respond to Paris. It's a prerequisite, but it is far from sufficient. And that then plays out in terms of the language that Carly was talking about, this sort of prosperous vision, if you like. And we have to have this prosperous vision. But actually, I think there are problems in that, because I think it treats us all and I know Carly is fully aware of this anyway, but this sees us in a too much sort of homogenous way. We're not homogenous. There are huge differences in responsibilities for emissions, and they are astronomically different. And so whilst for the majority in society, even in, as I said before, most people in the UK, most people in Sweden are below average emitters by definition. For the majority, probably it's going to be structural change, physical structural change, with some significant but nevertheless incremental adjustments to way of life potentially. But those structural changes might be like improvements in quality of houses through retrofitting, through better public transport, better jobs agenda in trying to drive all the renewables and all the other infrastructural shifts. But for those of us that are responsible for the lion's share of emissions, and it's really worth thinking about, that small group, relatively small group, there are no neat, prosperous stories for most of us. The language of sacrifice is the accurate language to use. Now, we might find in 5 years' time, you might think about our children and think, yes, actually, it's been good for us. But as you move out of the larger houses and they get split up into smaller houses, as our cars get taken on board to become local taxis or whatever it might be, we won't be seeing that as progress. We won't be seeing that as prosperous. So we can't write this story for people like me or nice left-leaning people. We've got to write this story, this narrative for all of us. And it will not look prosperous for many people. But that's a small group. They're the ones responsible for the lion's share of emissions, and we hide away from that repeatedly. And until I think we're prepared to do that and recognize that's where the rapid changes have to come about in the near term, it's a rationing issue. Climate change is innately a rationing issue. And the rations are being, either in energy or emissions, are being taken by a relatively small group of people, even in the wealthy societies. And until we recognize that, we will just continue to fail.
Thanks, Kevin. Any other takers?
Yeah, I'll have a bash. So I suppose I feel like this draws a tension for me in climate action work, or particularly policy work, that the scale and urgency of what is required is so great that it has to be, you know, it has to be right now. It has to be so like a language of sacrifice, splitting people's house, taking their cars from them. So that's one sort of framing of looking at it. Another is, what are the values of people at the moment in society, and what are different groups willing to get on board with in terms of climate action? And the thing that I worry about, the thing that sort of keeps me awake at night, is the balance between those two, because I get the sense that people don't want to go for you know, a lower level of emissions reduction because that's not the level that the science says we need to do. But I think there is an inherent risk in that actually, by not building these wider coalitions for action where people can see a prosperous future for themselves within it, you actually will spend the next 5 years not really making much progress at all, and blowing most of the carbon budget. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think it's a real tension. But for me, if we have to make everybody think like us about what's important in the world before we get rapid emissions reduction, I don't think we'll get rapid emissions reduction. So I think you have to find areas where there's crossover. There's some really interesting work done by some colleagues in the Tyndall Centre at Cardiff University around the discourses for environmental action that speak to right of centre voters. So things around independence for your nation and avoiding waste and things like that are much more compelling narratives for right of centre than issues of inequality or, you know, or social justice. And I think it's those coalitions that will really unlock action on this, but it's more complex than saying it has to be a 13% per annum reduction and it has to be now, regardless of sort of what your values are. And I think in terms of how do we get rapid decision making happening, this is a really boring answer, but I think decision making is really important. So decision making in organisations. And I think that is an end of pipe thing about stopping doing stupid things that we're doing at the moment. So don't declare a climate emergency one day and expand your airport the next day. But then also going back to the beginning of like strategy development, how do you embed low carbon, zero carbon in strategy development? That will take slightly longer to come through, but you need to kind of tackle it from both sides. So I don't think it's an exciting, snazzy answer, but actually embedding this in organizational practice, that is how we will get action happening, both quickly and in the what we might call the medium term here, which is like sort of 3 to 5 years.
Thank you, Carly. We only have a few more minutes left, and there's a question in the chat that looks at the intersection, I guess, between gender and the climate crisis. How can we encourage our society's masculinity to act responsibly in the climate crisis? Question.
Well, if I can jump in, I'm not sure what masculinity is, but I think that on my part, to stay with the just transition movement and discourse, I think that what has been really, really key and important there, it's been to start realizing that when we are talking about certain sectors, the fossil fuel dependent sectors, we're not talking about the labor movements in its totality. We're talking about a specific part of it, which is we may or not may be the most relevant. It's definitely not the most relevant part of industrial and also waged labor in industrial countries, because we are relocating industries elsewhere. So it's becoming more important in other parts of the world. But in any case, it is key to recognize that when we say labor, we're not talking about the male blue collar muscular worker, the miner, the steel worker. That is only a fraction of the working class and of the labor representatives. Should have really clear that this to me has to do with gender, because this has to do with a certain male-dominated way of representing the working class historically. Nowadays, both the pandemic and the fact that economies are changing these facts are also telling us that it is high time to re-envision the working class in a different way. And maybe that is a first step to understand that the working class is not necessarily contrary to a post-carbon transition. It is in fact impacted by climate change like everybody else, and it can also have a post-carbon transition. It is also an opportunity for working class people to have better lives. So I think this has to do with gender, in my perspective.
Thank you so much, Stefania. And it's now 5 to 5, which means it's time to wrap it up, I guess, Isak.